Oh, we got it. Welcome, everybody, to the Culture of Life podcast. My name is Andrew Jacoby, and I am blessed today to be able to speak with, and welcome, by the way, Sister Ilia Delio. Sister Delio is a Franciscan sister of Washington, D.C., and a professor of theology at the University of Villanova. Sister, thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
joining.
Andrew.
I'm super interested to talk to you. I've been listening and reading your work, and it's kind of blowing my mind. I'm a new Catholic, and I come from a long couple of decades sojourn in what you might call the Eastern traditions. So Buddhism, Hinduism, be here now, all this sort of thing.
Right.
And so I thought I was graduating from that into Catholicism in a certain way. And yet you're listening to you, I'm sort of like, I feel like I'm bridging these worlds a little bit. So I'm
Right.
super interested. The first question I had for you is, in your view, what is the normative role, if any, of religion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think religion, first and foremost, deals with our ultimate concerns. What are we ultimately drawn to? What gets us up in the morning? That's our deep. So religion really has the root ligare to ligament. Like what binds us to the ultimate meaning of life? That's the basic fundamental understanding of religion. And therefore, religion is about binding power. Maybe that's another way to say it. Every person has a religious dimension. There's something that pulls us into a deeper meaning of life. And how that meaning is expressed, our belief systems around it, the stories we tell around it, that becomes then shaped by religious practices and ritual. But religion is not institutional. It's actually biological. It's part and parcel of, in a sense, what we are.
So I've heard in your talks that you've given this idea that there's a misapprehension then in the modern world, and maybe over the past few centuries, of God's role in standing in judgment of the human person and their activities and the fallenness of man. Are we talking about, could you speak a little bit of that? And are we really just highlighting a debate within the Catholic tradition between the Thomistic view and, let's say, the Duns Scotus, Bonaventure, the Franciscan view?
Sorry about this.
Yeah, no problem.
This is the coffee I should. Right. I really think those narratives that God stands in judgment and we're a fallen humanity and God judges our actions. That really got very juridical, like God's like the big Supreme Court judge. And that's really not biblical. I think even the notion of God as judge, even in the Old Testament, is more like a God who's more like a parent who gets upset. Like if you start doing silly things or stupid things, overspend or crash the car or something like this. So God's like, look, I'm taking the car away, or I'm limiting your budget. And that's the kind of God. It's a God who if God is judge, it's a judgment out of love. I think God is that love. And so love will always, in a sense, want the best of the one God loves. I think sin, I do think we're a little bit fractured. We do make wrong choices sometimes, but I think this notion of original sin is not all that healthy. Maybe there was something in the human species that emerged in evolution, like we actually came into higher consciousness so we could choose against the good, like we could become selfish and consciously selfish, like I'm really going to do this for myself. And maybe that's, what original sin is, but I don't think there was a single couple, for example, who disobeyed God and drew humanity into this terrible condition of darkness and suffering and death, and now we need to be relieved from it. That has nothing to do with modern biology, quite honestly. So we need a realistic sense of who we are. I don't think God asks us to be unrealistic. Religion is not something extraordinary. It's something that's deeply ordinary, but actually it fulfills what we are. That's that's the thing. So I think we've been a little bit off about religion, quite honestly.
Interesting. Do you think that characterization is fair as it relates to the Catholic intellectual tradition, and as it goes, let's say, more towards the will with, let's say, the Franciscan and the will to love, the will versus the intellect, maybe with Aquinas and the Dominicans?
Yes.
Is that a fair kind of, because you're on the Franciscan side of that?
Yes, I am on the Franciscan side, right. Not to be too hard on the Dominicans, because I do think Thomas Aquinas was a brilliant theologian who really did for his time what I'm trying to do in my own time, and that's be attentive to the sciences and natural philosophy. But he did rely heavily on Aristotle. And I think the problem is not so much with Thomas, but in the way that Catholicism has appropriated Greek metaphysics, Greek metaphysical thinking on substance, matter, form, which kind of lend to an understanding of God that was self-sufficient, absolute perfect being, a God who can't change because, for Aristotle, change was an imperfection. So God is perfect. And so importing those ideas, Greek philosophical ideas into Christianity, I think has been largely unhelpful, quite honestly. I think it has distorted in some ways the biblical God.
Interesting.
When you go to the Old Testament, God gets angry, he gets upset, but God's always like, come on, come back to me with all your heart, let's get up.
Stop worshiping the golden calf.
Yes, God never leaves the people of Israel. He's there, I am with you always until the end of time. So this is a God who's unconditional in love and faithful as a companion on the journey. So I find a dissonance between the biblical God and the Greek metaphysical God of Christianity.
Interesting. So, go with Nietzsche's idea that Christianity is Platonism for the masses. It's a sort of translation. Modern Christianity is a translation of Greek metaphysic to the modern world. So, but God in the Old Testament, he is wrathful. So it's not truly an unconditional love, because, or maybe you could say that his anger is a form of love in a way, because he's saying,
yes.
Look, you're acting in object, or let's say you're not acting in love, so therefore I'm angry with you. How would
sort of again, I think it's that kind of, because the God of the Old Testament is nothing other than the God of the New Testament. So
Sure.
They're not two gods there.
Right,
Same
right,
God.
right.
So, you can kind of read backwards and say, well, even in Job, God strips Job of everything, and it wasn't just to prove God's power. It was, in a sense, to bring Job to his senses, like who are you, as a human person? And sometimes, like in the Nietzschean idea, we can lose sense of who we are, and therefore we become gods, and that's really the problem. And it's understanding that this power of life, this power of love that's at the heart of us is a power that needs to be part of us. In other words, who we are exists in relation to this power of life. And when those things get out of whack or imbalanced, where we think God is irrelevant, who needs that thing anyway, like we're gods now, we can have, well, then you have problems. When the human becomes God and replaces God with human will and power, that's all over the place.
Right,
Then it's whoever has the most money and
the will to power.
The will to power, exactly.
Right. So does that, because I've also heard you with you have a different view of the nature of God from the typical Thomistic view of God being unchangeable in principle, simple.
Right.
So does that mean you also you dissent from the typical Aristotelian / Aquinas arguments for God's existence as being a first mover, meaning that if we're existing philosophically in a series of contingencies, we need some kind of ground where that is not contingent,
right,
in order for these contingencies not to resolve into an ever going logic, which is a logical impossibility, a sort of never-ending series of contingent acts. So do you reject that as well? Because that's where the philosophical work is done to say, okay, well, now we can assume if God is this uncaused cause, we can also make other assumptions, although we can't know everything about God. We can certainly assume some things about his simplicity, his all-power.
Right.
Do you reject the underlying argument, or just some of the conclusions?
I reject the argument, actually, because I don't think I don't think causality, at least in the Aristotelian sense, or this kind of logical causality from prime mover to secondary causes, really holds anymore, quite honestly. I mean, if we look at modern science, and especially in the area of quantum physics or even Big Bang cosmology, science is coming up with completely new understandings. In fact, the word causality has more and more of a limited sense. I mean, it might work on the large level, like if I push this cup over the table, it will, fall and crack. So that's a causal event. But underneath that, there's a whole field of quantum physics that's going on there. And so, language of entanglement, for example, that relationality is first and foremost the condition for individuality, for a cup being a cup and me being human. And we can't get our heads around that, because quantum physics and concepts like entanglement or complexity are still relatively new. But to me, this is where theology needs to really catch up. I mean, what we're doing is we insist on taking philosophical concepts from the Middle Ages and importing them into the 21st century world. And it's like saying, I think I'd like to, maybe walk the, 500 miles to Boston rather than drive in a car, because,
right.
I mean, how do you do these things? How do you just take, a medieval concepts of matter and form and import them seamlessly into the 21st century when it's a completely different cosmos? It is not static. It's not hierarchical. It has a rather mysterious beginning. We don't know what the Big Bang is. That's just a term, like a shorthand term to say that something happened about 13.8 billion years ago, and even that number now is being revised. I just recently saw a number up to 20 point something billion years.
Yeah, I've heard you say that you're open to the Aristotelian idea of the eternal universe potentially.
Yes, I mean there's a possibility. So what I'm saying is, I think one of the words that we need to bring back into greater focus is mystery. That science itself now is more and more up against the wall of mystery. It keeps pushing back the hands of time, so to speak, and comes up with all sorts of theories about this universe. Are we a multiverse? Are we one of many universes? Are we in a parallel universe? Are we operating actually in tandem with another universe? Really fascinating ideas, but no scientific evidence whatsoever,
right,
because our mathematics just aren't unable to really deal with these questions
right.
at this point.
So you just reject the idea that we can know if there was a beginning, because that's been used a lot for, hey, look, nothing from something. It was
right, the ex nihilo, idea, but even that I saw recently in terms of physics, ex nihilo as being this completely homogeneous field of energy out of which something emerged. So there's a lot of speculation. Honestly, I don't find that question helpful at all.
Interesting.
I think we need to revise our understanding of beginnings itself.
Interesting.
Because even if we ask that question, we are implicitly thinking in concepts of linear time, that there was a beginning and time has developed, in this way. But we know from quantum physics that space and time themselves have been completely revised by the laws of relativity. So we're not thinking in a way that's really consonant with the world in which we actually live.
Is part of the and this may have to correct me on this, but my understanding of the causality chain is that there's certain two types of causality. Like the one would be this linear thing. So for example, I walked in here, I turned on your heater, and then I walked out. The heater doesn't need me anymore because in this time sequence, I left and the heater can still go. But then there's also a vertical one, let's say. So for example, you are sitting on the chair is sitting up. So right now there's a kind of time independent, right now in this moment, vertical dependency happening. Does that am I characterizing that correctly?
Yeah,
and does that change your view in terms of?
I wouldn't look at it as vertical dependency. I look at it as a field, like there's a field of forces. So it's not just vertical or horizontal. It's vertical, horizontal, X-wise. That there's a constellation of forces at any one point that are acting on something to exist in this particular moment in this particular way. That those forces are in constant. I'm not even aware of the forces, that are operating on me at this point, and which allow me to sit on this chair. I guess another way to say this is we're too reductionistic. I think this kind of linear thinking can easily lend to a reductionism that's equivalent to scientific reductionism.
Right. It's not a clean stacking.
Right, exactly. So religious reductionism and scientific reductionism become part and parcel of the same kind of line of thinking. And neither are helpful because they're not really consonant with the way the sciences are just opening up to a much more, it's a richer domain of existence. And, every science is trying to understand this domain, this matrix of existence from their particular perspective.
Right. It's very difficult to do so. As Einstein said, it's not stranger than you think, it's stranger than you can think.
Exactly.
Right. So there's this other Aristotelian import through Aquinas, right, through the scholastic interpretation of Aristotle, but the idea of formal and final causality.
Yeah.
So the church bases a lot of its moral teaching on this idea that things have a nature, but parts of your bodies. For example, obviously the big elephant in the room is sexuality, right? Because when we talk about love, there is this idea in the culture, there's this moniker or love is love.
Right.
So anything I want to do, which is really saying anything I want to do sexually is fine.
Right.
Whereas the church's dissent against that is being cast in the same way of like, hey, that's you're talking about Middle Ages, mid-age,
Yeah.
And the church's argument back is, well, actually, no, it's basically an Aristotelian argument. There's a nature we can determine what sex is for based upon what it does.
Yeah.
And therefore we can say that it's procreative and unitive as its nature, and therefore anything that's not of that is disordered towards the obvious rational ends of sex. How would you sort of dig through that mess?
Yeah. Well, again, I see these arguments. I think they're outdated, quite honestly. I think they're not in touch with the way, again, science, and here I'm thinking the way quantum physics, evolutionary biology, and more so systems biology, the way that what we call today the new materialisms, which is a field of philosophy that is looking at the flux, the openness of matter, the panpsychic nature of matter, mind as part, sort of as the inside of matter, a part of matter. And so what we find today is the unfolding of life, that's described under the rubric of evolution, is a much more organic unfolding of fields of complexified forces. So that nature is constantly, almost like cybernetics would be. So three aspects that might be helpful here. Cybernetics, the way information is constantly being shared and shaping that which emerges. So cybernetics, complexity, that things intensify in relationality, and emergence, that new things constantly keep emerging in nature. So all of this to say is, from the point of evolution, there are no such things as inherent biological essences. Given enough time, boundaries change, life forms change as something new emerges in evolution. We Homo sapiens are not Homo australopithecines. We are not, and yet we emerge out of that long, long lineage of the hominid species. So again, I find this juxtaposing of medieval Thomistic ideas with modern biology is very dissonant. It doesn't make much sense to me. So another way, I think the church's position there, it doesn't hold a lot of weight, and that's why a lot of people don't really pay attention to it, quite honestly, because it's not a negation against the church per se. It's saying that the experience of personhood is different than just having something intrinsically ordered or disordered of some sort. That what we are as persons is a constant process of engaged activity between self and world, that, whether it's psychological, emotional, sexual, physiological, that we're in this constant multidimensional framing of self as we engage with the world. We create the world, and the world is creating us. So we are worlders of the world. And therefore, one of the great areas today to show that biological essence is outdated is technology. The notion of cyborg or cybernetic organism. Up until 1960, we never thought it'd be possible that we could actually strap machines to a human and send a human into conditions outside terrestrial space to exist. And yet that's exactly what we did when we sent, the first quote-unquote man on the moon. And so the cybernetic organism is symbolic of the post-human, or that human that's beyond the essential self-liberal autonomous subject. That we can put machines in us, we can put pacemakers in us, hearing aids in us, we can change those biological boundaries with mechanical devices. And so that has become, in a sense, certainly the grounds for transhumanism, which that has its own field of questions and concerns. All I'm saying here is biological essence is not apparent,
Okay, so there's two other places you could go with that. So if we're gonna reject the Aristotelian, let's say, formal and final causality of human sexuality, let's say, amongst many things, but it's a good example of how the church is bringing in an older concept philosophically and trying to apply it. There's also there's a lot of normative language in the Bible, both Leviticus, New Testament, prescribing marriage, not marriage, sexual activity, not sexual activity. Are we also supposed to view that as hey, they didn't know what they were talking about back then? It was a long time ago, and things have evolved since then. Or are we to accept that normative language? Because there's two basic arguments against, let's say, human sexual freedom, what they would call. One would be this Aristotelian idea of, well, it's disordered towards the obvious or rational end of sexuality in itself. So in fact, for example, it would be impossible for two people of the same sex to actually have sex. They could engage in sexual activity, but because in principle they couldn't procreate, it's not actual sex because it couldn't be in principle, right? So that would be the Aristotelian view. You've rejected that. How about the normative language in the biblical stories? Do you think that that's outdated?
Yeah, I think we have to read the Bible with a sense of it's mythic. It's a story. These are stories that are written within particular historical periods, and I think they hold immense value, immense wisdom, but I don't take them literally. And so I think we read them with a sense of reflection of what this means, like what is this living word of God meaning in my life right now? So some of those stories may hold true and some may not. I think with regard to the question of sexuality and sex, I think to be sexed is to be cut off. Right, to be halved. That's actually, the word has nothing, it didn't begin with, biology. It actually began, in different contexts. You can sex a tree, for that matter. You can cut off the limb of a tree. And so that's the thing, like anything that's been cut off is seeking its wholeness. That's what sex is ultimately
Platonic
about.
idea. He also had this idea that we're both halves walking around.
Halves, but I think, it's we're made for wholeness. I think that's the fundamental, and that to me is what Genesis is about. That's what the Bible is about. We're made for wholeness.
Interesting.
It's what religion is about. And so we will always be, I think Ron Rolheiser says this best in his book, The Holy Longing. He says we wake up with a deep longing. We have an aching heart. Because, like Augustine said, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, but our hearts are restless till they rest in you. Now, it could be platonic, but it can be actually very physically real, right? You meet someone, whoever that person is. So I would get away from the language of sex and gender, like as if we know exactly what these are and we're going to tell people what they are, and look at persons. These are persons in formation. So that, you meet someone and that person, they complement you. They help make you whole. They free you. And I think what happens is when we don't allow people to be free in who they are, they live their lives with anxiety and guilt and this sense of alienation. And therefore it's alienating to the whole of life itself. Like people cannot participate in the world to the fullest of who they are because they're constantly going around with this bag of stones.
Got it. Interesting. And do you see that there is, like, for example, I think it was Paul VI in Humanae Vitae talked about this. If we get away from the church's basic teaching on contraception, for example, and it comes from this sort of Aristotelian view, but he's basically saying what would happen would be essentially the instrumentalization of the other for pleasure. And there's going to be all kinds of negative consequences. So you could look at it sociologically. For example, I look at my parents' generation. The expectation was virginity until marriage. And that required a lot of suppression of desire in order to live out that, right? And it required a lot for example, from my father, Dad, I love you. But he wanted access to my mother in order to do so. Yeah. He had to elevate his behavior such that she would be willing to accept his advances in that way. We're talking, let's say a little metaphorically, but we get what we're talking about. And so and that happened, and they were married, and that was the expectation at that time, whenever that was in the 60s. And then a bunch of liberated sex was, let's say, dumped onto the marketplace, right? A huge amount of this liberation of this desire for wholeness that you're talking about took its and I think what Humanae Vitae said, and what I think we can see is a lot of distortion. And now people, instead of, if they're going to engage in something as sacred and powerful as the reproductive act, in its fullness of the ability to procreate and actually create a new human life, a new soul comes into the world, which is pretty powerful.
It is.
If you're going to take that and, like in what they said in the beginning of of the Odyssey, and you're going to slay that sacrificial lamb and eat it, you're going to take that highest thing and use it for food, then a lot of distortions can come of that. A lot of utilization of the other, a lot of cynicism. Let's say, for example, I can say from my sex, the male part of the species, behavior went down because now it was sort of, well, if I don't have to elevate my behavior a certain way in order to have access, I can just flip on my phone and find somebody who's willing. I'll just stay with my mom and smoke weed and play video games all day. And there's going to be some woman who's willing to grant me access.
Yeah.
And so, what do you see any of the potential for that degradation, and therefore the value of the church's teaching there?
Yes,
even if you disagree with the philosophical underpinning.
Yeah, no, I do think. I think the church is right to that point, in the sense it's calling us to be conscious of who we are before God, and therefore I don't think random, just a lot of it becomes very selfish, and we become very, I think the selfish sexual person, where you can be on your video or, go for your dark web apps. And that's a person who's deeply connected to themselves. And I do think there's something about, the idea, all things in moderation. It's just not, we keep giving into our selfish tendencies. So what I find is that, if I want sex now, I'm going to demand it. It's just kind of very egoic, very self-centered. And that kind of sexual, it's a animal. Animals are better at this as well, So we're called to something higher. Maybe put it this way. We humans are called to live on a different level. And I guess that is, who are you? Before engaging in loving another person sexually, who are you? Do you know yourself? So I do think there needs to be a better way forward in a kind of a spirituality that would lead to meaningful sex, on whatever level. But today we built a culture of gratification, and sex is just one part of it. So it's commodified. So it's like a package. You can buy it on Amazon for all that matter. And therefore it's been cheapened. It's actually lost. And so going back to that question of love, it's lost its deep, profound meaningfulness. And so that sex becomes an expression of the ecstatic nature of human personhood. And there's a real that's the spirit. There's a spirituality of sex, actually, that's completely missing from the way modern culture has commodified it and made it available to anyone who wants it. in a culture that is completely fragmented in terms of self-identity.
Got it. So you don't perceive that would be a necessary, like what I think what Humanae Vitae was saying, that would be a necessary, if we remove this barrier, it's obvious what's going to happen logically. You would disagree with that?
So I find the church just a little bit too black and white. If this happens, this is going to happen.
Right.
Well, it's just that life doesn't work that way. I would like the church to help people become more discerning in their ongoing decisions. Having these kind of rules, here's the rule. If you break it, you're going to be on this side of it. It's not helpful. We have not really helped people grow into human personhood, and therefore to be conscientious of one's decisions. That if you fall, to fall in love is terrific. How do you fall in love in an absolute way? How do you give yourself? Thomas Merton has a great article on, is love a need or a package? And, love is our deepest reality. We are made to love. I think that is the core of what defines us as humans. But, it means that not only do we have to grow in love, we have to climb out of the cradle in love. We have to learn to give ourselves away. I think sex is that ultimate giving oneself away. It's sort of the end point of growing in love, not the beginning of it. In fact, I think if you just jump into sex, without ever thinking about things, you never grow in love. You're constantly looking for gratification. So my class just watched the movie Her.
I've never seen that
Spike
movie.
Jonze's 2013 movie, where Theodore Twombly, opens up with his failed marriage. His wife asks for a divorce. He's really depressed. He's writing, cards for this electronic Hallmark company. And he is in a store one day and he comes across a new new operating package that can have a personal, loving relationship with you. So he buys the software, the operating system, and opens it up, and her name is Samantha. And the operating system becomes a new avenue of awakening in love for him. Like he becomes lighter. He becomes open to his friends again. His letters for his Hallmark company are more upbeat, and the whole thing is about, can technology reawaken in us the need for love? And I think it's both interesting and sad. There's something about humans that have really kind of failed in love in some ways. And part of it is the way religion has, Christianity has developed these kind of rules and rubrics around love. So, families having 8, 10 children, maybe that's good and maybe it's not good. How do you support a family of 10? So we've lost, it's all over. It's really sad. But what Merton is saying is, like, you have to grow in love. And that begins with finding who you are. Who are you? And then growing into that self, and then out of that self to give yourself away in love. And therefore, love is like a development, sort of like the Big Bang universe. It begins to expand. And then it begins to grow in consciousness. And then it begins to see others in a new way.
Interesting. So your recommendation would be more, I guess, I've heard this from the Jesuits, a discernment of spirits, essentially. Mm-hmm. That's the model of morality that would be more, it sounds like from what I'm getting from you.
Yes, a discernment of spirits is a great way to look at it.
Yeah. So as opposed to relying upon these logical constructs.
Exactly.
You think more from, hey, how does this feel? What do I think that God is telling me at this moment? Am I doing this act from a selfish perspective?
Right. The consolations, the desolations. Who is this for? How does this make you feel? How does it make the other person feel?
Interesting. So do you, as I mentioned before we started recording, I'm a new Catholic, well, relatively new, a couple of years. And so maybe I have to understand what it is to be Catholic. And so my understanding was, and maybe you could help me with this. My understanding is that I'm sort of, I'm going away from my ability to sort of make a Protestant move, what I'd call a Protestant move, which is I say, hey, look, I have a Bible, you have a Bible.
Right.
I'm going to read this thing, you're going to read it.
Right.
And like
you and Jesus.
It's just me and Jesus. I think Carl Jung said that eventually it'll fractal itself out till everybody has their own denomination, because everybody has their own interpretation of what they're reading from religion. So what we're warts and all, what we're trying to do with the Catholic faith, or at least my understanding of it is that we have this repository, this magisterium of teaching from a long period of time for really wise and smart people from a long time.
Yes.
We're sort of, as you said earlier, religio, to bind. We are binding ourselves to something outside of ourselves. We're tapping into a bigger brain. I actually had a very interesting conversation with Professor Napier, that's what I mentioned also to you about. He has this argument that he's playing with, which I'd love to get you guys in dialogue about, where he says that he thinks that he can make an argument for, if anybody's anywhere, Catholic or not, is coming up with a difficult moral quandary, they should default to what the Catholic Church says, because it's been tried in so many places, and the adherence to the Catholic Church's teaching produces saints, produces people who live their lives completely dedicated to love, warts and all. But anyway, that's a side point. So to go back to my Catholic question. Okay, so I had difficulty with the Marian doctrine in the beginning. I'm like, why don't I go directly to Jesus? Like, why, she's, who's she? I mean, I know she's her mom. I'm sure he loved her, but she's not God. So why don't I go directly to Jesus? But over time, I'm like, I came to this place where I'm just like, okay, maybe I don't understand it, but I'm just going to assume that the church is right and I'm wrong, given how much darkness I came up with trying to navigate my own life. And since I've done that, it's been very helpful. So my question to you is, do you dissent from that my general view of what it means to be a Catholic, and is your view that, well, I can sort of view Catholicism as kind of a cafeteria? Like, if I like the Jesus part, great, like that's awesome. But if I think this whole Aristotelian Thomistic line is a little bit skewed, I just go a different direction with it.
Well, I think to understand it really is to go back to, the fact that Christianity emerged out of Judaism. And so Jesus was Jewish. He was always Jewish. He died a Jew. So he was never Catholic. So I think, that's the first thing, is to recognize that the Catholic Church is a construction in the early Christian movement. And for a lot of different reasons, among which are political reasons, because Constantine the Great wanted consolidation of the entire empire, East and West. And so up until that point, Christianity was a minor sect. You could be persecuted for saying that you were a Christian.
Right.
And so, and yet, what's so interesting in that early period of Christianity prior to 325 AD is that to be a Christian was to really be committed to the way of Jesus Christ.
It was called the Way, wasn't it?
The Way. They were disciples of the Way.
Right.
But it meant also martyrdom, that you would be willing to risk your life based on your commitment. And therefore, what's important to me is the commitment, right? So there is something about, it wasn't just Jesus in his earthly ministry, like the social worker Jesus, who, did good things. And it was the belief that Christ had been raised from the dead. It was belief in the resurrection. It was belief that God is doing new things. That's exactly what captured the minds and hearts of very, very early Christians. And it was belief that death would not have its last word over us. It was belief that suffering did not have his last word, that Jesus was risen from the dead, that God is life, and that life would prevail even beyond death. So that really impelled a lot of people like Polycarp or Felicity and Perpetua, to risk their lives, literally, to put their life on the line, to say, if I am a Christian, this is what I am, and therefore I will give my life for this. That's apart from any rules, any canons, any kind of distinctions between what's intrinsic and what's extrinsic. Exactly. And I think that part of, and what was important about that? It's that the sheer living out of that commitment to unconditional love of God was so attractive. People would just flock to it. It was like a charism. It was like a fire, and people were drawn to that fire, and it kind of ignited, itself from out of, Asia into, not Asia, into the where it began in that period of Palestine and then into Europe, etc. And therefore, I think when it became a state religion, it became very juridical. But I think the other part I wanted to go back to is why the term Catholic became important, because Ignatius of Antioch is the first one to use that word Catholic. And it really meant that we have a new sense of the whole now where God is center. And it was symbolized by the Eucharist, that we are called into a unified, way of life. We're called into a new community where the poor, the lame, the sick, those left outside are called into a brotherhood and sisterhood. And that's what Catholic meant. It meant a new wholeness where God, or the love of God now is the animating center of that wholeness. So we translated it into the universality, and then it became the exclusive doctrine of Jesus as the universal Savior. And so it was that you must follow this way to be saved. And I think we lost our way, quite honestly. And I think what we lost is that Catholicity, rather than the ism of Catholic, it's not institutional. It's the enkindling of life around the wholeness of God's love. And I think for our own age, which is an age of pluralism, it's religious pluralism, it's ethnic pluralism. To think that we're going to have everyone become Catholic is just rather, talk about full of oneself. That's about as egoic as it gets. Yet what we are called to is give witness. We're called to something the same as the early Christians. So instead of talking about being Catholic, you have to live it. I don't think Catholicism is something that you talk about. It's something that you are. That's what it means to be Christian. And that means to live what you are. And what are you? And that's the question. And therefore, are you really committed to that unconditional love of God within yourself? Are you willing to act out of that love of God? Are you willing to give your life, on behalf of the gospel, for the sake of more life, for those who are left out of life? And that, to me, is what Catholic is about. We are not called to be right. We're called to be whole. And I think we're called to be whole makers in a world that is desperately seeking, a center, a wholeness.
So, do you see yourself in a way as sort of a modern Martin Luther as a woman? Like in a way where you're saying, or are you saying like, I think we should go back as a Catholic Church to this initial idea that we had that got lost in, because wasn't Luther sort of saying similar thing? He was sort of saying, look, I'm a monk, I'm a Catholic, I love the Catholic faith, but we've gone off the rails. Like
Thomas Merton, you mean?
No, I'm sorry. I meant Martin Luther. Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther. Where he was saying
Luther.
that we've taken on this papal barnacles on the boat of Christ, and we're not going in the right direction
actually,
anymore.
I do think there was a real value. I think the Protestant Reformation was a wake-up call to the way that the Catholic Church had become very powerful and privileged, and really kind of entrenched in the very things that undermined the initial inspiration of it. And so I think he was right to call attention to those things. And it's really unfortunate that we have ostracized Protestants as if they're like half-baked Christians or half-baked Catholics, when they're actually bringing, it's like a corrective in some ways to what Catholicism is about. And I think we can learn. I have many of my colleagues are Protestant, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for them. They are, first of all, deeply committed to the Christian faith. They are deeply driven by, the love of God, and seek to help make this world, more whole by their works, whatever they're doing. So, I think this whole Catholic Protestant thing
is overblown on the Catholic
way
side.
Overblown,
right.
And I think. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that.
No, please.
I think that it's time. I think this is what Pope Francis is trying to do in his own way. It's this church of triumphalism, the triumphant Catholic Church. It's over, and it's becoming more and more over. And it's not that people are angry anymore. They don't really care about this anymore. we live in a very different world that is very quickly changing before our eyes with technology, by the way.
Sure.
And so one of the things is that religion is becoming irrelevant as technology becomes more and more relevant. So one of the maxims is technology will fulfill what religion promises.
Interesting.
And I was just showing in my class the other day, the aims of transhumanism and the aims of religion are the same aims. Human betterment, freedom from suffering, to live on forever.
Right. Meaning you're talking about putting on my consciousness in a box.
Exactly.
Something, kind of upload my right, the metaverse or something.
However they're going to do it technologically. Right. That's one thing. But the aims of transhumanism are the same aims as the Judeo-Christian tradition, and Christianity in particular.
Interesting. Would you... it seems to me a little bit of a difference in the fact that they want to it's more of a Gnostic view where they're thinking that we can sort of do this spiritual surgery where it's my spirit that is, is primary, and I can
all that blend of Gnosticism and all that kind of stuff. So that
seems very modern in that way. Like Descartes, my consciousness is primary. I think, therefore I am.
Yes, the consciousness is an epiphenomenon. Like we can just take that consciousness and download it and repackage it and put it into chips and things like that. So that's another issue.
That's separate. But you're saying the fundamental underneath that.
Yeah, and what we need to pay attention to is that which drove religion in the past. That spirit, that impulse, has now been transferred to technology. Interesting.
There's a particular technology. So just to put a period or a punctuation mark on the Protestant Catholic thing. So you don't see dissonance. For you, you're saying, look, I'm Catholic. I love the Catholic faith. I think there's parts of it that I disagree with. I think the church is wrong about certain things, but I feel comfortable being a Catholic within that context.
I do, because I don't think Catholicism is
dogma.
Yes, I don't think it's like, ta-da, here we are. Right. I think it's just starting. I don't think we haven't really fully awakened to the whole import of Catholicity.
Got it. So we're just like, that was like part one.
That was part one. That was sort of like maybe a dress rehearsal that's gone bad a little bit.
Okay, you know? Okay, so there's this interesting debate recently I heard with some Catholic I think it was one Orthodox gentleman, Jonathan Pageau, and then Bishop Barron, versus Dr. Jordan Peterson and somebody else about psychedelics. So technology. Yeah. There's a lot of people that are using psychedelics. Right.
Yeah. Microdosing and stuff like that.
And they're sort of and there's a sort of their argument on the pro psychedelic side is like, hey, here's this technology that we can use.
Yeah.
We sort of we lick on a frog or whatever.
Yeah, right.
And we can almost reliably produce what we would call, psychologically at least, a religious conversion.
Right.
William James would look at that and say that person was not religious and now is, because he's seen God in the funny man that he saw in his psychedelic dream or his ayahuasca trip. And the traditional religious people were like, oh, no, that violates you're dipping into a world that's way above our pay grade spiritually, and there are dark forces potentially. Talk to some exorcists about that, and you will see there's some potential problems with this. Okay, how do you view this?
So I think, one thing is just to be aware that any religious experience is going to have a physiological component to it. Like, you can't talk about religious experience apart from what we are in terms of brain and emotions, etc. So, to say that I can, chew on a mushroom and have, a release of dopamine or some neurochemical that actually is released and produces a spiritual experience that is can't be distinguished from, say, someone who meditates. Well, that's exactly right, because those two events are actually producing the same neurophysiological response, right? Meditation, we know, does involve neurochemical changes. There is dopamine release or whatever the neurochemicals are. I think it is dopamine.
And you could have an euphoria from that. Or
years ago, Andrew Newberg and his D'Aquini wrote the book, The Mystical Mind.
Right. They're studying the monks.
Right, and so they could trace neurologically the changes in the brain. But to me, that's just what you would expect, right? We are physiological, biological beings. That's exactly what you would expect. The difference is this, I think. So I can induce is that a religious experience? Well, momentarily, it is a spiritual experience. That's exactly right. It's not diabolic or anything. That's just silly. I mean, it's just a normal physiological response to inducing neurological change, and that could be by meditation or by, chewing on mushrooms. The difference is this: a religious experience is one that becomes transformative of the person. So meditation, while it may have dopaminergic releasing mechanisms over time, and it's the practice of it over time that begins to shift other levels within the person. Levels of consciousness begin to change. And therefore, as consciousness begins to shift, the way we begin to see the world shifts. The way we see the world shifts changes the way we start acting in the world. So it becomes not only a physiological change, but a deeply personal, transformative change. That becomes then a religious experience. One's faith and belief system is changed precisely because one's awareness of God has changed. And therefore one commits oneself to God in a new way.
Right. And the world has changed for them.
Exactly. And that's different from, say, the episodic smoking on weed or whatever it does to induce that sporadic or spontaneous religious quote unquote spirit. I would call it a spiritual experience, because that spirit is, in other words, there's an energy release there.
So you're not against it in principle. You would say, though, it just means that you had an episode. And what you would want a chronic religious experience.
You'd want to be a transformative religious experience.
If you could use it for that, it's fine. Like if you say,
but
I said, Sister, I want to go into the Amazon and find this shaman and have this ayahuasca experience. And you would say, hey, look, sounds like a fun trip. And if afterwards you are changed by it, great, you did a great thing.
Yeah. The other thing, though, like real transformative spiritual experiences actually means like a total transformation of personhood, which means there's an asceticism that's involved. You have to discipline the body.
You can't push a button.
You can't push a button. You can't just chew on something or smoke something. And so that goes back to the self-gratification of the culture. Yeah. We want the experience without the expense of changing ourselves.
Is that why you're a sister? Is that why you've taken the step of being a religious sister?
Rather than staying in pharmacology, you mean?
Well, it's you've taken let's say a different path. I mean, a religious vocation is a different path. You're taking. I'm assuming as a Franciscan sister, you've taken certain vows.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I think for me to be a sister, I could say basically that. My heart was grasped by God. So, in other words, it's being taken up by the love of God in a particular way that I wanted to commit myself to God for life. And that it's a commitment that's much deeper than anything like an experience of any one particular sort. But like any life, whether it's in religious life or married life, it's a commitment. And so it's a commitment that's not just one time in the past. It's an everyday commitment to that which is most deepest in my life, to which I am called.
Interesting. And did you ever was it a question for you about married life versus the religious vocation, or were you always God seized you and you're like, there's no man here that's ever going to do this?
No, I dated and all that kind of stuff. I was actually almost quite kind of pre-engaged to someone for like 3 years. Then I thought I probably would have to kill him or something because marriage wasn't. I knew I wasn't called to the married life. I just knew it.
You just knew it. So you're like, you're a nice guy.
Exactly. And I love to have male friends. I do. But I just was never called. It's a calling, and I think if we really know ourselves, we will know what we're called to. If we're called to be in a partnership, in a married life, or a celibate life, it's where you find your freedom. Where you are truly at home in yourself, you're truly free, and out of that freedom, you can be and do who you are without.
That's really beautiful. Thank you, sister. You've been super generous with your time. I know I'm good for a little while, so I don't know if you can go for another 10 minutes or so, if that's okay with you, or if,
5.
Yeah, 10 minutes. Okay, so the last question I have is. Okay, so there's this. I'm interested in political science and political philosophy because I think it's an important way that we arrange our. Because you said matter is. We could
Right.
go, there's a ton of different directions we could go, Chardin and everything. But I have this interest in this. The Holy Spirit put this on my heart. So there's this idea that, look, you take Korea and you split it up, and there's two different political philosophies. One is basically a kind of concentration camp, essentially, and the other one is more or less thriving modern culture.
Right.
So it's really important the political ideas under which we live.
Right.
So there's when I hear you talk, there's other people out there saying, okay, this guy John Vervaeke, I don't know if you know who he is, the philosophical or the religious Silk Road he's talking about. It's like we have to get rid of this Christianity thing because it's like you said, it's old, it's relying on Aristotelian metaphysics, and come on, let's just get over this. And yet we live in a culture birthed out of the church. So essentially, we talked about Constantine. I mean, you had the Roman Empire, and then after that, Europe was Christendom. It used to be Christendom, and then and so it's deeply transformative. And there's this other historian, Tom Holland, who wrote about. I think he's an atheist, although he might be changing that now. But anyway, he was talking about how we just take for granted the universality of human value, essentially, like the Greeks. To go back to your problem with the Greeks, let's say if that's a chapter that we talked about. They would have had no problem with slavery. It's natural. Some people are stronger than others in this world. And, Nietzsche was talking about that. That was his problem with Christianity.
Right.
It's anti-natural. Why shouldn't the strong subjugate the weak? Why there's this natural hierarchy? I mean, the eagle doesn't feel bad eating the rabbit, or whatever. Right. So Tom Holland's point is that, no, we've grown out of this Christian ethos, this Christian context, and now this so this is the seed corn that we built our modern societies out of. Now we're sort of we've eaten into this seed corn, let's say from the Enlightenment, and we're saying, oh no, we're going to go away from these Aristotelian ideas of the social animal in our nature, and we can just be individual choosers in a societal contract, this kind of thing. And so there's one critique is, hey, we've got to go back to the Christian. There's going to be an operating system in our political order. The Christian one is the only one that makes sense because it's the one that really birthed what's good, or most of what's good about it. Yeah. The other side is, no, we need something new. It's not the operating system is too old for Christianity. We need this much more ecumenical. We've got to sort of sift around and find something else. Yeah. And this, like John Stuart Mill would say, we've got to do a bunch of experiments in living, essentially, and sort of each come to our own thing. And so there's this, I think that, you have people like Patrick Deneen. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work in Notre Dame. But anyway, talking about, no, we've got to go back. This liberalism experiment of everybody doing whatever they want is clearly insane. Yeah. So I'm a jumbled question, but my point is where do we go from here as a group of people, as a country, as a society? Yeah. What do we do given updates that we need, let's say, from your view? Yeah. And how to live together? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm aware of all these various positions, and yet I think where we've really gone off course is that when I hear how these various positions are trying to be argued about, they come out of abstract speculative thinking and philosophical ideas. And I think one way to kind of resolve this mess is to return to nature. We are first and foremost of nature. We are human beings. We don't just arrive out of nowhere. We arrive out of a very, very, very long process of evolving life. So my first thing is know where you come from, not in some spiritual platonic way, but in a real biological way. I think if we understood what our evolution is about, half of the questions that we have would be resolved. So this whole fight or flight thing, and the birds eat the worms and all this kind of stuff. Well, yeah, there is something of that. There's a hierarchy in some ways in nature, but nature is about life. I mean, if you look at evolution, we should not even be here after about 5 major extinctions, and yet there's something that's pushing through into life, right? So nature's our best teacher. That would be number one. Second is that there's a power here that seems to be not only within nature, but we are moving towards more complexified life. And that's not a religious idea. That is actually coming from the sciences. You can map information today, and you will see a grid of increasing complexity. Something is taking place. Teilhard de Chardin called this personalization. There's a personalizing tendency in evolution. Third is that evolution has direction. We're moving towards something. But we don't know what that is. And scientists will say, no, evolution doesn't have direction. But again, you begin to look at the pattern. We move from very simple cellular life into more complex life with increasing consciousness. So something is taking place here. The question of Christianity as being the overarching meta-narrative is no longer tenable. While Christianity may have built the Western Europe and much of capitalism, actually, there's been a lot of dark side to that. So how to look at religion, how to look at, say, Catholicism. And I think it's how we understand tradition as taking the core values that illuminate life and bringing those values into explicit reflection within our own time today as we understand what does salvation mean? What is eschatology? What do we long for? And how do we begin to answer those questions is not from, 15th or 14th century, but from the world of science, from the world of culture, from the world of, wherever, history, however these worlds are being, and technology would be one of the biggest lessons today of what we're about and where we might be going. So it's not about tradition. I think tradition is very valuable. I don't think we just start from out of de novo, each time. We're always, in a sense, emerging. We are what the past is, but we are on it on a different level. We are not, living in the 13th century. We're living in the 21st century. And therefore, the best of what Francis of Assisi or Bonaventure or Thomas Aquinas were, that has brought us to this moment. That's exactly right. There's a beauty in that tradition, but we don't stay there. I think what I hear many times is that we kind of lose sight and we live with dead remains. We live with relics. And we're called, the New Testament is about life up ahead. The whole thing is forward moving. Never once does God say, look to the past, stay with the past. That tradition is what will get you here. No, because the whole of Scripture is about what's taking place now. It's the now into the future. And the future is always the realm of infinite possibilities, right? God is that wealth of infinite possibilities. But in order to realize those possibilities, we must act. We must respond to the call of God in this moment. And that's why I really lament being really constrained by medieval metaphysics, not because they're bad. I think they're fantastic, actually, but because they limit our vision and our openness to what science is now pointing us to what the way philosophy itself is beginning to shift the way we understand what is existence, what isn't, the way we understand symbols and symbolic language, the way we have, in a sense, we have confused ontology with symbol. So even the word God, where we have this idea of this big guy in the sky, instead of a symbol of a power of unconditional presence and love at the heart of our lives, that is life itself. I am, where
ipsum esse subsistens.
Exactly, right?
So existence itself.
Exactly. That is what the name God means, existence itself.
Right, according to Aquinas.
Yes, and he was right on that one,
right? You give him a point.
I give him a point. Yes, exactly. So it's never
seem very compatible.
Never the past. It's never about the past. It's the way we have taken the past in what Whitehead said, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And we've made the past and we're trying to forge it into the present. Therefore, when you do that, you have neither past nor present. You have a confusion. And I think what we're called to is to be not only rationally intelligent, but spiritually intelligent. And therefore to be reflective and to be attentive as to that power of love that is God that's still working in us and calling us into a new future.
Interesting. Is there a danger that in Eric Voegelin's language we might be attempting to immanentize the eschaton, or that we have higher expectations about what's possible in this life, or do you think that that's just another old view that this view is like this world can be so much more. There could
Exactly.
be a heaven on earth where the lambs and lions are
Well, I
lying
think
down
that's what
together.
heaven is. I think heaven is earth's openness to its fulfillment in God. And therefore, how we understand that is not something platonic, like we're not going to a place, that place is the mystery of this ongoing life. And that's what's hard to get our heads around, because we still have old ideas on matter and spirit and body. And we can't get our heads around that the whole thing is energy,
Right.
and the highest energy is spirit itself.
So as
So-
St. Catherine would say, all the way to heaven
Is heaven. Exactly.
Amen.
No, I think we live with infinite potential. We're entirely too small in the power that we have right within us. And therefore we think too small, we imagine too small, and we create too small. And therefore, we have the possibilities of, being part of a new world, a new heaven. If that's just a random idea, that's unattainable, then I would say get rid of it. That's just silly, and just live in this present moment. But I'm saying that I think there's a reality that, because that's in a sense what science is telling us as well. There is infinite potential within, and the ground of that potential is God.
Heaven is right now.
Yeah.
And or at least our potential to find it on earth if we live with
Exactly.
God's love. Sister, thank you so much for your time. You've been really blessed to spend the time with you, and it's been really fascinating for me, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.